The fluorescent lights hum their continuous mechanical prayer as Brooke Sullivan pushes through the ER doors at Cedar Creek Medical. San Diego summer heat still radiates from her scrubs even though she's been inside for 43 minutes. Her left shoulder rolls backward, old habit, old injury, catching slightly as the cold air conditioning hits her damp skin. The antiseptic smell wraps around her like a second uniform, sharp and chemical and somehow comforting in its sterility. She clips her probationary badge to her chest. Master Chief Petty Officer. Those words are locked in a classified Pentagon file 3,000 miles away. Here, she is just Brooke. Just a nurse. Just another fresh grad learning how to read a monitor. The nursing station is chaos in slow motion. 3 nurses juggling 7 patients. 2 empty beds waiting. 1 attending physician who hasn't slept in 22 hours. Brooke moves through it with the kind of precision that makes people uncomfortable, too efficient, too methodical, too aware of things she shouldn't notice. She organizes charts before anyone asks. She flags medication interactions that won't show up on the system for 6 more hours. She walks like someone used to moving through hostile territory, weight-balanced, ready to shift directions in a heartbeat. The nursing director, Patricia Chen, watches her from across the station. Frowns slightly. Fresh graduates are supposed to flounder. They're supposed to ask questions. They're supposed to fumble with 4 lines and forget where the supply closet is. Brooke does none of those things. In her locker, in the break room on the 3rd floor, sits a tarnished military challenge coin. She touches it every shift. Just a finger. Just enough to ground herself. The coin is worn smooth from 18 years of hands holding it, hands that had extracted 12 wounded soldiers from a burning supply truck in Kandahar. Hands that had held pressure on a throat wound while calling in medevac. Hands that had written 847 chart notes in the last 90 days, and apparently those notes have become a problem. Dr. Marcus Whitfield strides past the nursing station at 2:41 p.m., his white coat fluttering behind him like a cape. Chief of Surgery. 48 years old. Titanium wedding ring that probably cost more than Brooke's monthly rent. He pulls a chart from the rack, one of hers, and his eyes narrow as he reads. She knows those eyes. She's seen them before on officers who were about to make decisions that would get people killed. This is what happens when hospitals hire inexperienced staff, Whitfield announces to no one in particular. His voice carries the specific kind of volume that demands attention. 2 nurses look up. An orderly stops pushing a stretcher. Brooke's fingers pause on the keyboard. Chart notes like this? Dangerously incompetent. He holds the chart up. Waves it like evidence. The handwriting is precise. Every medication documented. Every vital sign recorded with exact timestamps. Every observation cross-referenced to the patient's history. There is not a single error in that chart. There is not a single incomplete line. Brooke's jaw tightens imperceptibly. The kind of movement that would be invisible to most people. The kind of movement that a trained operative learns to make instead of screaming. She does not look up from her keyboard. Her hands remain steady on the keys. The fluorescent lights buzz overhead like angry wasps. Maybe you should go back to nursing school and learn how to write a legible chart note, Whitfield says. He's looking directly at her now. The chart is still raised. His smile is the kind of smile that carnivores wear. The room goes quiet. Not the peaceful quiet of focused work. The sharp quiet of people pretending not to listen while their ears burn. Brooke finishes typing the sentence she's writing. A complete sentence. Grammatically perfect. Then she closes the chart application and stands. Her movements are fluid. Economical. She walks toward the break room, toward the vending machines, and she does not acknowledge Whitfield's words with so much as a glance. He follows her. Of course he follows her. The vending machine sits in a narrow hallway outside the break room, humming its own lonely mechanical song. Brooke approaches it like she's approaching a known threat position. Calm. Aware. Ready to adapt. She slides coins into the slot and presses the button for black coffee. No sugar. No cream. Just the sharp bitter taste of fuel. Whitfield stops 2 feet behind her. Close enough to be aggressive. Close enough to make it clear this is deliberate. You understand that patient was scheduled for a routine pre-op assessment, he says. His voice is lower now. More dangerous because it's quieter. And you documented it like you were preparing for a trauma review. Every detail. Every notation. Every observation that makes it seem like I might have missed something. The coffee drops. Brooke reaches for it. Did you finish nursing school, Miss Sullivan? He doesn't wait for an answer. Because the way you document, it's almost like you're building a case. Building a file. Testing to see what happens when someone doesn't follow protocol. She pulls the coffee free from the machine. The cup is hot. She can feel the heat through the cardboard sleeve. She takes a sip. The coffee tastes like pennies and bitter clarity. I have documentation from your first month, Whitfield continues. Medical records from patients where you flagged observations that turned out to be nothing. Nothing. Just rookie paranoia mixed with incompetence. And now you're in my ward, writing charts that suggest I'm not doing my job correctly. Doctor, Brooke says. Her voice is quiet. Not deferential. Just quiet. Controlled. The kind of quiet that comes from someone who has learned that volume is wasted on people who aren't listening anyway. I document what I observe. You document to create problems, he says. And I'm beginning to think you're not cut out for this role. Hospital security might have some thoughts about professional boundaries. Maybe we arrange for them to escort you out. See if you're even qualified to work in a licensed facility. He steps closer. Close enough that she can smell his cologne, something expensive and aggressive. Close enough that his voice drops to a register that is definitely a threat. Your probation, he says slowly, is not a guaranteed position. One phone call to Patricia Chen. One recommendation from the chief of surgery. You understand what happens then. Brooke sets her coffee on the vending machine. She turns to face him. Her jaw is set. Her eyes are completely still. The kind of still that comes from someone who has learned to make emotion invisible. She does not tremble. She does not blink. She does not give him the satisfaction of flinching. I understand, doctor, she says. Is there anything else? The way she says it, not submissive, not aggressive, just absolutely neutral, makes something flicker across Whitfield's face. Irritation. The specific irritation of someone who pushed and did not get the reaction he wanted. He holds her gaze for 4 seconds. Then he turns and walks back toward the surgical ward. Brooke reaches for her coffee. Her hand is completely steady. No tremor. No shaking. Just a hand that has held worse things than insults. She takes another sip and returns to the nursing station. Patricia Chen glances at her but says nothing. The 2 nurses who heard everything pretend they heard nothing. This is how these things work. This is how women in hospitals learn to survive. But that wasn't the worst part. At 3:22 p.m., the ER doors burst open with the specific violence of paramedics who have driven Code 3 through 3 miles of San Diego traffic. The stretcher comes first, metal wheels squeaking against the tile floor. Then the paramedic, shouting vitals. Male, 40s, unconscious, severe blunt trauma to anterior chest, hit-and-run victim, found unresponsive in the intersection of 5th and Broadway, no identification found on the scene. Brooke is on her feet before anyone else. She moves toward the trauma bay with the kind of automaticity that comes from 264 field rescues. The paramedic is calling the vitals, blood pressure 74/41, heart rate 132, respirations rapid and shallow, oxygen saturation 86% and falling. The patient's shirt is torn. Bloody. There is a laceration on his chest that looks like it might have punctured the pleural space. She helps transfer him to the trauma bed. Her hands move with mechanical efficiency, cutting away his ruined clothing, running a quick visual assessment. The wound is deep. Too deep. The bleeding has mostly stopped, but that's because he's running out of blood to lose. She reaches for gauze to wipe away the blood, and that's when her fingers brush against something metal tangled in the torn fabric beneath his clavicle. Dog tags. Her hand goes completely still. The kind of still that is a choice, a deliberate control mechanism against the sudden flooding of adrenaline. She does not look down. She does not react. She simply reaches deeper into the wound and extracts the tags carefully. They are military issue. They are attached to a beaded chain that is caught on what looks like scar tissue from a previous traumatic wound. The engraving reads, Ranger. Army. Fort Benning. Bagram Air Base, 2019 through 2022. Brooke's jaw tightens again. Not from Whitfield's words. From something much deeper. From recognition. From the sudden and absolute knowledge that the Pentagon surveillance protocols just became activated. Dr. Whitfield has not appeared. He is somewhere in the building. Somewhere in the surgical ward reviewing his phantom procedures. Somewhere building the empire of fraud that has been her assignment for the last 91 days. He has no idea who just walked through those ER doors. He has no idea that a Master Chief Petty Officer was standing in front of him at a vending machine 14 minutes ago, accepting his insults with the composure of someone who has seen far worse. But now there is a wounded Army Ranger on her trauma bed. Now there are dog tags in her hand. Now the operation has entered a new phase. She slides the dog tags into her scrub pocket. The cold metal presses against her leg next to the tarnished challenge coin. 2 pieces of evidence. 2 pieces of military identity. One nurse who is about to decide whether to save this man's life or preserve her cover. The choice is already made. The conference room at Cedar Creek Medical on a Wednesday morning smelled like weak coffee and the particular tension of junior physicians waiting to be humiliated. 23 residents and surgical fellows sat in theater-style seating facing a projection screen. Brooke stood at the back wall, her badge reflecting fluorescent light, her posture a study in professional invisibility. She'd been at the hospital 3 months. In that time, she'd learned the rhythm of the morning rounds the way soldiers learn terrain, the danger zones, the safe corridors, the moment when everything changes. Dr. Marcus Whitfield entered carrying a manila folder. His tailored suit probably cost more than Brooke's monthly rent. He'd made senior surgeon by age 42 through a combination of genuine skill and willingness to cut corners that would have made most physicians lose sleep. He didn't lose sleep. Grand rounds, he announced, settling into his chair. I want to talk about documentation standards. He opened the folder. Brooke's charts filled the projection screen. Her notes on a trauma patient from 3 weeks prior, the kind of granular, precise wound documentation that belonged in a military field hospital, not a San Diego ER. Whitfield circled sections with a red marker, his movements theatrical. This right here, is dangerously incompetent record keeping. The room shifted. Pencils paused. A surgical fellow in the 3rd row straightened, suddenly interested in whatever was about to happen. Nurse Sullivan, Whitfield continued, his voice pitched to carry authority, has documented wound characteristics with unnecessary detail that suggests she thinks she's a surgeon. She's not. She's a probationary ER nurse who apparently doesn't understand her scope of practice. He turned to face the back of the room where she stood. His eyes found her with the precision of a predator. Brooke's left hand gripped her right wrist behind her back. The trembling wasn't fear. It was restraint. Do you have anything to say, Nightingale? Whitfield's voice dripped with the kind of condescension that was meant to break people. Or did they not teach professional humility at whatever community college you attended? The room went so quiet you could hear the ventilation system working overhead. 23 residents waited to see if the probationary nurse would cry, apologize, crumble. Brooke met his eyes. Her face was a mask of professional composure. No, doctor, she said quietly. She didn't flinch. She didn't blink. Whitfield smiled like a shark that had drawn blood. Good. Let's keep it that way. 2 hours later, Brooke was at the vending machine in the staff lounge. The coffee inside the machine cost $1.75 and tasted like someone had filtered it through hospital walls. She'd take it. She'd take worse. Whitfield appeared beside her as she inserted coins. He was still wearing his surgeon's coat, still radiating the authority that came from being right 90% of the time and having the institutional power to ignore the other 10%. You know what I think, Nightingale? His voice was low enough that only she could hear, loud enough that the 4 nurses on the other side of the lounge would strain to listen. I think you're in over your head. I think you fabricated some of your credentials. And I think if you can't meet basic standards, maybe security should escort you out before you kill someone. Brooke pulled her coffee from the machine. The cup was hot. She held it steady, her hands perfectly still. I heard Cedar Creek had hiring standards, she said quietly. I guess you were busy that day. 2 of the nurses pretended very hard not to have heard that. The third one nearly choked on her water bottle. Whitfield's jaw tightened. He wasn't used to pushback from probationary staff. He wasn't used to anyone finding him remotely amusing. Your shift ends in 30 minutes. My office. We're discussing your future with this hospital. Brooke took her coffee and walked away. Her reflection in the vending machine glass showed nothing but a woman in blue scrubs, holding a cup of terrible coffee, looking forward to nothing at all. By 3 o'clock that afternoon, Brooke's suspension from patient care had been formalized. Whitfield's office was all mahogany and framed diplomas from prestigious schools. He'd sat behind his desk, positioned higher than the chair where she sat, and reviewed her personnel file with the methodical cruelty of someone disassembling something he'd already decided to throw away. 3 months probationary, he'd said, turning pages. No references from previous employers I can verify. Charts that read like military field reports. Personnel gaps in your employment history that I find deeply concerning. He looked up. Something doesn't add up, Nurse Sullivan. She'd said nothing. I'm recommending immediate termination review, he'd continued. You're suspended from patient care pending investigation. You can work intake only, paperwork, vitals, nothing that requires actual clinical judgment. He'd leaned back in his chair, satisfied. Consider yourself on thin ice. The ER was understaffed, as it always was. Too many patients, too few bodies, too many charting requirements that had nothing to do with actual patient care. Brooke's reassignment to intake meant fewer eyes on her work, but it also meant fewer opportunities to access the secure wing where her actual target patient was recovering. The high-value service member she'd been embedded to protect. The evidence of fraud she'd been methodically documenting. Whitfield had no idea that Brooke had spent the last 3 months photographing his falsified surgical reports, cross-referencing his billing codes with procedures that had never actually happened, tracking phantom surgeries billed to the Veterans Affairs Administration. $734,000 in fraudulent claims. 43 wounded veterans overbilled for procedures they didn't receive. Whitfield running a side operation that made his legitimate surgeon's salary look like pocket change. Her suspension meant mission failure. Her discharge would end the investigation. And Whitfield had just made sure both were coming. But that wasn't the worst part. At 11:47 p.m., a stretcher arrived at intake with the John Doe from the hit and run. Whitfield's orders: transfer him to County General in the morning, clear the bed for a paying patient. The patient was stable, his vitals steady, his chart marked for routine discharge. Brooke processed his intake paperwork, her eyes cataloging details her training recognized immediately: extensive scarring consistent with shrapnel wounds, calluses on his hands that came from weapons and ropes, the particular way he held his shoulder suggesting either dislocation repair or years of humping a rifle across difficult terrain. She wheeled him to the observation area for a wound check before his transfer. His shirt was still soaked with blood, the fabric stiff and dark. She cut it away carefully, exposing the chest wound Whitfield's ER resident had closed hastily 8 hours earlier. Metal tangled in the fabric as she worked. Dog tags. She froze. Army Ranger. Bagram Airfield Deployment Dates. Current status, active duty, emergency contact information redacted. Her hands moved before her mind caught up. She cleaned the wound with practiced efficiency, her fingers working in a specific pattern, the stitching technique she'd learned not in nursing school but in a forward operating base 32 months earlier, when a 19-year-old from Kentucky was bleeding out in a supply truck and she was all that stood between him and a casualty flag. The Kandahar stitch. Compact. Field efficient. The kind of wound closure you learned when you had 3 minutes and no certainty you'd see tomorrow. The patient's eyes flickered open. He stared at her hands for 2 seconds. His voice was hoarse, barely above a whisper. That's a Kandahar stitch pattern. Brooke's eyes snapped to his face. You were downrange. She pressed a finger to her lips. The gesture was military, a signal older than words. You need to rest, sir. But he was still watching her hands, still watching the way her fingers moved with the terrifying fluid precision of someone who'd done this before, who'd done this under fire, who'd done this while rounds were impacting around her and someone was screaming in the darkness. Bagram FOB. His voice was barely functioning, but the recognition was absolute. Helmand. She didn't answer. She couldn't. But something passed between them in that moment, a confirmation, a key turning in a lock, a door opening that couldn't be closed again. She pocketed the dog tags carefully, documenting them in the chart as a found item pending identification. The paperwork would protect them. The paperwork would protect her, at least a little longer. His vitals were stable. Transfer approved for 6 a.m. Brooke returned to her intake station and tried to focus on the blood pressure readings and temperature logs and all the procedural tasks that were supposed to be her world now. At 2:34 in the morning, the monitors went wrong. The alarms were precise and specific, a sound like machinery screaming. Brooke's body moved before her consciousness caught up. She was running, her quiet shoes making no sound on the tile, her badge bouncing against her ribs, her mind already 3 steps ahead of her body. The John Doe patient was crashing. His chest wound had ruptured internally, the arterial bleeding beneath the surface that the ER resident's hastily applied closure had failed to control. Blood was pooling in the thoracic cavity. His pressure was dropping. 65. 60. 58. The night resident stood frozen in the doorway, a textbook in human paralysis. Page Dr. Whitfield, Brooke snapped. Not a request. Not a question. The resident fumbled with his phone. His hands were shaking. He's not answering. The patient's oxygen saturation was falling. 59%. His heart rate was climbing like he was running from something his body already understood was coming. 142. 150. The kind of tachycardia that meant the end was approaching with terrible velocity. Brooke looked at the chart. Looked at the patient. Looked at the chest wound that needed decompression and the pressure that needed stopping and the time that was running out like water through her fingers. 20 seconds to brain damage. 40 to cardiac arrest. She'd extracted 12 wounded soldiers under fire in Kandahar. She'd kept a Marine alive for 6 kilometers with nothing but her hands and training and the refusal to let go. She'd held bodies together in a supply truck while explosions walked past them like a predator deciding which prey to take. She was suspended. She was under investigation. She was 1 shift away from termination. The John Doe patient was dying. And the choice of what to do about that had already been made the moment his eyes met hers and whispered her secret aloud. Brooke stepped forward. Her hands were already moving. The transfer order came through at 11:11 p.m. John Doe, still unidentified in the system, his chart marked only as trauma patient, no insurance, no emergency contact, was being moved from the secure wing to Brooke's intake station for re-evaluation before transfer to County General. Whitfield's orders. A way to shuffle the problem patient out of the building and off his service line before dawn rounds. Brooke watched the orderly wheel the stretcher into Bay 4, the cardiac monitor already ticking its steady rhythm, oxygen saturation holding at 92% on the nasal cannula. The dog tags were still in her scrub pocket. She had cleaned them with a paper towel, her hand steady, her mind already calculating what came next. "Vital stable," the night resident said, barely glancing up from his phone. 26 years old, second year, the kind of doctor who learned medicine from PowerPoint slides and did everything by protocol. He's on observation. Whitfield wants him out if there's no change by morning. Brooke nodded, said nothing, moved closer to check the chest dressing. The sutures were clean. The wound had stopped weeping. But underneath those bandages, her hands that had sewn up worse than this in a Kandahar aid station with nothing but a headlamp and a prayer, could feel the damage. Internal bleeding didn't always announce itself. Sometimes it whispered. Sometimes it waited until you were asleep. She was 3 minutes away from leaving for the night when the heart monitor's rhythm fractured. At 2:34 a.m., the beeping pattern shifted. 1 beep. 2. Then a sound like an electrical whine, a noise the human body makes only when something critical has torn loose. Brooke was at the bedside before the resident's eyes opened. The John Doe's chest heaved, once, twice, and blood began to pour from the bandaging site, not seeping, not trickling, but pouring like someone had opened a valve inside him. Internal rupture. The original wound had been deeper than it appeared. The vessel repair had held through surgery, but the trauma had damaged something else, something that took hours to tear completely through. "Code Blue, Bay 4. Brooke's voice cut through the night shift like a blade. "Get the crash cart. Page anesthesia. OR prep now." The resident fumbled for the crash cart button. Too slow. Brooke was already moving. She grabbed the defibrillator pads from the wall, her hands moving on muscle memory older than her nursing license, older than anything she did in scrubs. The John Doe was seizing now, his body arching, oxygen saturation dropping like a stone. 85. 78. 70. "Get me a crash cart and 2 units O negative." She was already cutting through the bandaging, her trauma shears snapping open the surgical tape that Whitfield's surgical resident had closed just 12 hours earlier. "And call Dr. Whitfield. Tell him his patient is exsanguinating." But there was no time to wait for Whitfield. There was no time for anything but the truth of what she was, a woman who had held a soldier's chest open in the back of a supply truck outside FOB Shank while artillery shells walked closer and closer, her fingers working in blood and dust and terror. A woman who knew how to break a sternum the way some people knew how to tie their shoes. The night resident stared, frozen. "We need to get him to surgery." "He'll code in the elevator," Brooke said. Her voice had changed. The careful deference, the probationary softness, it was gone. What remained was the voice of someone who had nothing left to lose. "I'm opening him here." She didn't ask permission. Permission was a luxury for people who had time. She grabbed the surgical tray, and muscle memory took over. Scalpel. Cautery. The smell of burning flesh, copper and ozone, the same smell she had breathed in the dark of a combat hospital, the same smell of survival. The chest opened in a wide line down the center, and the bleeding vessel was right there, yawning like a mouth. Suction. Blood pulled away. 2 units O negative. Now. The resident moved. The night nurse appeared, hands shaking, reaching for the hemostats. Brooke's fingers were already there, already clamping the vessel with the precision of someone whose hands had done this 50 times before, whose hands knew the weight of a life balanced on the edge of a cardiac massage. She opened the chest wider. Ribs cracking open like a door. The heart lay beneath, pale and still, and she put her hand on it. One hand. Direct cardiac massage through an open chest, not CPR, something deeper, something that belonged to battlefields, not hospitals. She could feel the chambers under her fingers, the septum, the aorta, the reason a man named Nothing was still breathing. "Come on," she whispered, and she began to squeeze. The heart responded. It had to. There was no option for failure. Squeeze. Release. Squeeze. Release. Her other hand worked the bleeding vessel, finding a smaller rupture in the left intercostal artery, clamping it, holding pressure. The night resident was frozen, his mouth open, his hands useless at his sides. "Don't just stand there." Brooke's voice was ice and command. "Get me a 4.0 suture, epinephrine 1 mg 4, and keep those units coming." O2 sat climbing. 85. 90. 92. The vessel was repairing itself under her hands. Not perfectly, not the way a surgeon would do it, but the way a person who had spent 3 tours in Kandahar would do it, with efficiency and prayer and the knowledge that perfection is the enemy of alive. The bleeding slowed. The heart's rhythm steadied under her fingers. She could feel the pulse now, weak but real, a soldier's heartbeat, a rhythm that said, "I'm still here." Pressure dropping, the night nurse said, her voice small and lost. "Blood products." Brooke kept working, kept her hand on the open chest, kept her presence pressing down on the situation like a boulder holding back floodwater. 2 units in, 3rd running. Systolic climbing. 90. 100. 105. The man was coming back. She could feel it in his blood, in the way his chest rose and fell around her open hand. 15 minutes since the rupture. Maybe 18. Time moved like water when you were inside someone. Brooke began to close. Careful. Methodical. Sutures tied with the hands of someone who had closed wounds in the dark, who knew how a scar should lie to give the chest room to breathe, to live, to survive another day. The intercostal artery secured. The bleeding controlled. The ribs wired back together, not the way Whitfield would do it, probably not perfectly, but done. Done and holding. When she finally stepped back, her scrubs were soaked red from shoulder to thigh, and the John Doe's heart was beating on its own again, steady and strong, the monitor's rhythm a song of survival. That's when Whitfield walked in. 23 minutes after the rupture. 23 minutes of a night that had moved like treacle, a night where Brooke had cracked open a man's chest and sewn him back together in an emergency bay using nothing but hands and training and the kind of composure that comes from having already survived the worst. Whitfield stopped in the doorway, his face draining of color as he took in the scene, the blood, the open instruments, the closed chest, the patient who should have been dead but wasn't. His jaw worked. Once. Twice. "What the hell did you just do?" Brooke stripped her gloves. The sound was crisp in the sudden silence, latex snapping against itself like a gunshot. She didn't meet his eyes. Didn't need to. He was coding, she said quietly. "You were unreachable. I stabilized him. You performed an authorized surgical intervention." Whitfield's voice was a blade sharpening itself. "You performed emergency thoracotomy on a patient without a surgical license." That's, he stopped. The monitors beeped. Somewhere down the hall, a clock ticked. Whitfield looked at the patient. Looked at Brooke. Looked at the night resident, who was staring at Brooke like she had just descended from heaven. "Get her out," Whitfield said to security, who had appeared in the doorway behind him, drawn by the code. "She's suspended effective immediately. I want her escorted from this facility." The nursing supervisor intervened, her voice trying to hold the line between protocol and common sense. "The patient is stable. We need an incident review before." "She's done," Whitfield cut her off. His face had gone white, then purple with something that looked like rage but felt, underneath, like terror. A probationary nurse had just demonstrated surgical skill that belonged to a trauma surgeon, and Whitfield understood, in that moment, that something very wrong was happening. Something beyond his understanding. 24 hours, she's gone. Brooke walked out of Bay 4 with her hand still sticky from blood she had no time to wash off. The night air hit her face as she moved through the ER doors, and she could feel Whitfield's shadow behind her, already pulling out his phone, already making the calls. The incident report would be filed by 3 a.m. The board members would be called by 3:30. By dawn, there would be a consultant reviewing her credentials, and by noon, there would be paperwork moving through channels with Whitfield's signature on every page, his connections pulling strings that went deep into hospital administration. What he couldn't understand, was that Brooke Sullivan, probationary nurse, Master Chief Petty Officer, embedded investigator with 3 months of work into medical billing fraud that was bleeding veterans dry, had just burned her entire cover to keep a man alive. And she had exactly 24 hours before her life changed forever. The incident report was filed at 3:17 a.m., while Brooke's hands were still damp from scrubbing blood from beneath her fingernails. Dr. Whitfield sat in his office on the 4th floor, the fluorescent lights casting his face in shades of institutional green, and typed each word with the precision of someone executing a strategy he'd perfected before. Unauthorized surgical intervention. Gross violation of scope of practice. Patient endangerment through reckless assumption of authority. The phrases stacked like accusations, each one a brick in the wall he was building to bury her before she could finish what she'd started in that trauma bay. By 3:44 a.m., he'd made the first phone call. Dr. Leonard Pierce, chief of the hospital board, picked up on the second ring. He always did, even at that hour. Whitfield had referred 12 patients to Pierce's private orthopedic practice in the last 18 months. 12 referrals meant roughly $340,000 in procedural revenue. The currency of favors in this institution wasn't money. It was access, reputation, the kind of referral network that made careers. "Leonard, I need you to understand what happened in that trauma bay tonight," Whitfield said, his voice carrying the exhausted weight of a surgeon who'd just witnessed a catastrophe. A probationary nurse, barely 3 months in, he cracked open a patient's chest without authorization, without surgical training, without any business touching a scalpel. The silence on the other end was the silence of a man calculating what he owed and what he could afford to lose. Whitfield had positioned this perfectly. He wasn't asking for a favor. He was giving Leonard the opportunity to protect the hospital from liability. By morning, Pierce would have already spoken to the second board member Whitfield had identified, Dr. Harrison Bancroft, who'd received 7 referrals in the same period. 7 referrals. $210,000 in revenue. Both men would understand that a nurse who made unilateral decisions in the OR was a lawsuit waiting to happen. Both men would also understand that Dr. Whitfield was the one who'd brought Brooke in during the crisis, who'd been absent, who'd somehow missed the entire emergency. And if anyone asked questions about that absence, both board members already had their narrative constructed. The second call went to Susan Larson, the nursing director, at 5:22 a.m. This time Whitfield didn't bother with the measured tone. This was a direct command in the language of institutional power. "Susan, I need Brooke Sullivan's termination processed immediately. This morning. I'm sending you the incident report now. What she did in that trauma bay was criminal. We have security footage. We have documentation from the entire surgical team." He paused, letting that land. "I'm also bringing in an outside consultant to review her personnel file. We need to ensure this doesn't expose Cedar Creek to additional liability. She should never have passed probation. Someone in your department missed critical red flags." The consultant was already on his way by 6:15 a.m., a former hospital administrator named Martin Graves who'd built a career out of conducting independent reviews that somehow always reached the conclusions his clients needed them to reach. Whitfield had paid him $8,000 for this one. The amount was negligible compared to what the consultant would uncover, or rather, what he would make certain to frame in the most damaging possible light. Brooke's 3 months of perfect evaluations would be reinterpreted as suspicious. Her rapid rapport with patients would be recontextualized as boundary violations. Her documentation, which was immaculate because she'd been trained by the Navy's Medical Education and Training Division, would be scrutinized for inconsistencies that didn't exist but could be manufactured by selective interpretation. The dossier Whitfield was compiling wasn't designed to prove anything. It was designed to bury the truth under the sheer weight of procedural complexity, the kind of institutional armor that made it impossible to challenge without months of legal discovery. But that wasn't the worst part. The worst part was that Whitfield had already begun the process of ensuring that Brooke couldn't access her own investigation files. He'd flagged her credentials with the Medical Board of California at 6:56 a.m., triggering an automatic audit of her nursing license. He'd contacted the hospital's legal department and explicitly instructed them not to discuss the investigation with her directly. By the time Brooke realized what was happening, she wouldn't be able to defend herself using her own evidence because she'd be too busy trying to save her career to continue documenting his fraud. It was 7:08 a.m. when she walked out of Cedar Creek Medical for what neither of them yet understood would be the last time as a probationary nurse. Her scrubs were still damp with blood that had transferred to her skin despite 3 rounds of washing. The damp fabric clung to her legs like a second skin, cold and unpleasant. She'd sat in the staff bathroom for 14 minutes after her shift ended, staring at the tile floor, her jaw moving like she was working through calculations. But when she stood, her hands were steady. Her face was a mask. She'd had worse days. She'd had days where the mask meant the difference between keeping sick soldiers alive and watching them bleed out on a cargo net. The diner was 2 blocks from the hospital, tucked into a corner of 5th and India, a place called Rose's that had been serving the same breakfast menu since 1987. Brooke had never been there before. She chose it precisely because no one from Cedar Creek would think to look for her there. The bell above the door chimed as she stepped inside. The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead with a sound like distant electrical lines humming. Everything in the diner was beige and orange and chrome, colors that belonged to another era, colors that had the weight of permanence. She slid into a corner booth facing the door. Military habit. Always position yourself where you can see the entrance. The waitress, a woman in her 60s with kind eyes and a name tag that read Margaret, poured coffee without asking. Brooke didn't acknowledge her. She stared at her reflection in the window glass. What stared back was someone she almost didn't recognize. The hollow eyes were familiar. She'd seen them in mirrors in the Kandahar FOB, in the barracks at Bagram, in the heads-down moments after field surgeries where she'd worked for 8 hours straight knowing that if she stopped, someone would die. But the rest of it, the exhaustion, the weight of failure, the look of someone who'd been forced to watch her mission collapse in real time, that was newer. That was specific to this moment. She reached into her scrub pocket. The dog tags were there. Not the ones from the Army Ranger patient. Those belonged to him. These were her dog tags, the ones she'd kept hidden beneath her name badge for the entire 3 months of her cover. Master Chief Petty Officer Brooke Sullivan, USS Boneville, Social Security number redacted, blood type O positive. The metal was warm from her body temperature. She turned them over in her hands like prayer beads, like the kind of repetitive motion that could anchor you to reality when reality was sliding sideways. Next to the dog tags was the challenge coin. It was tarnished now, the silver worn to grey at the edges, the embossed insignia almost unreadable, a rearing horse with crossed rifles beneath it. The coin had been given to her in 2016 by her commanding officer, Master Chief Daniel Halloway, on the night she'd been medically cleared to return to active duty after the IED that took 3 fingers from her left hand. The coin meant survival. It meant the kind of brotherhood that transcended normal human relationships. It meant you'd seen things that would make civilians weep, and you'd lived anyway, and that living meant something. Margaret refilled the coffee cup even though Brooke hadn't touched it. "Long night, honey?" she asked. Not in an intrusive way. In the way that someone who'd worked diners for 40 years understood that people sometimes needed to be acknowledged without interrogation. "The longest," Brooke said. It was the first time she'd spoken aloud since leaving the hospital. Her voice sounded strange to her own ears, flat and precise and stripped of everything but function. The wall-mounted television was showing the morning news cycle on mute. Market reports. A weather forecast. A story about a warehouse fire in National City. Brooke watched the images scroll past without registering them. Her phone sat on the table next to her hospital badge. 6 missed calls from a number she recognized. Pentagon prefix. 703 area code. Arlington. Someone very high in the chain of command had finally noticed that a Master Chief Petty Officer embedded on a classified investigation had gone dark. That notification had probably triggered a chain reaction of phone calls, the commanding officer of her actual unit trying to reach her, the Defense Intelligence Agency checking personnel files, someone in NCIS beginning to ask questions that she was now in no position to answer. She'd failed. Not at saving the ranger's life. That part she'd done exactly right. The direct cardiac massage through the left anterior lateral thoracotomy was textbook field surgery. She'd performed the procedure on live casualties, not mannequins in a training facility. Her hands had known what to do before her conscious mind caught up. But she'd failed at the mission. The investigation into Whitfield's phantom surgeries, the documentation of how many wounded veterans had been billed for procedures they never received, the paper trail that would lead from Cedar Creek Medical all the way up the chain of administrative corruption, all of that was gone now. She couldn't document anything if she wasn't employed at the hospital. She couldn't access patient records if she'd been fired for an authorized surgical intervention. She couldn't build a case against a man who was already constructing his own narrative, already calling in favors, already making sure that by the time anyone asked questions about his whereabouts during the emergency, there would be a completely different story in place. The morning stretched toward 3:52 a.m. Brooke had been in the diner for 35 minutes. She'd touched the coffee cup once. She'd looked at the dog tag 17 times. She'd stared at her reflection long enough that the features had started to seem unreal, like she was looking at someone else's face, someone else's failure. The challenge coin was warm in her hand. She pressed it against the scar tissue on the back of her wrist, right where the IED had burned through her skin. Pain was information. Pain was data. Pain meant you were alive to feel it. Margaret appeared again with a slice of lemon meringue pie and 2 forks. "On the house," she said. "Everyone's got to eat." Brooke didn't argue. She cut into the pie with the edge of a fork. The meringue was crispy. The lemon filling was tart and real and present in a way that the rest of the night hadn't been. She ate half the slice without really tasting it. The kind of eating that was about function, not pleasure. The kind of eating that kept your body running when your mind had already checked out. At 6:45 a.m., her phone rang. The Pentagon number again. She didn't answer. Not yet. Not until she understood what was about to happen next. The investigation was over. Whitfield had won. But as she sat in that corner booth in Rose's diner, staring at her own hollow-eyed reflection in the window, she couldn't have known that the Pentagon had already begun to move. She couldn't have known that the moment she'd found those dog tags on the Army Ranger's chest, she'd triggered a chain of notifications that was now cascading through intelligence agencies with the force of an avalanche. She couldn't have known that her face was about to appear on every screen in Cedar Creek Medical, that the photograph they would use would be her in dress whites with a chest full of medals that no one in that hospital was supposed to know she wore. She couldn't have known that within hours, the Army Ranger she'd saved would be looking directly at Dr. Whitfield and speaking 3 words that would end careers. But she could feel it coming. The way you feel a storm approaching before the clouds appear. The way your body understands danger before your mind catches up. The dog tags were warm in her pocket. The challenge coin was heavy in her hand. And somewhere in the darkness between 3:52 a.m. and the moment the hospital doors would swing open at 7:12 a.m., everything was about to change. The locker door was already halfway open when Whitfield appeared at her shoulder, his presence like a pressure change in the room. 7:12 in the morning. The fluorescent lights hummed their mechanical song above them as Brooke pulled out her personal items, 3 pairs of shoes, a framed photo of her father, the tarnished challenge coin from her unit that she'd carried through 2 decades of service. Whitfield watched her hands move, his expression carved from contempt. He'd already won. The termination paperwork was signed. Security would escort her out. This was just the final ritual of humiliation, him standing there as a Navy nurse stuffed her life into a cardboard box. But that wasn't the worst part. Not anymore. Every screen in the hospital lobby switched at exactly 7:14 a.m. 83 seconds of silence before anyone noticed. Then a resident pointed. Then a patient. Then every voice in the building stopped. The news anchor's face filled every monitor simultaneously. "We begin this morning with breaking news from the Pentagon. This is Master Chief Petty Officer Brooke Sullivan, reported missing 3 days ago during a classified operation in San Diego. The Navy is intensifying search efforts and asking for. The image shifted to her official photo. Her real official photo. Not the probationary nurse ID. The one with a Navy working uniform and a rank insignia that belonged nowhere near Cedar Creek Medical. Whitfield's hand froze an inch from her locker. His face went the color of medical-grade gauze. Brooke didn't turn. She didn't need to. She could feel his entire understanding of the last 3 months collapsing like a structure built on sand. The television continued. Master Chief Sullivan is a decorated veteran with multiple combat tours in Afghanistan and has been. The broadcast cut to the lobby entrance. 2 military police officers in full dress uniforms flanked a figure in a wheelchair. The Army Ranger from Trauma Bay 4. The patient she'd arrested with her hands inside his chest cavity. His eyes found hers across the distance and he spoke one sentence, just one, but it carried the weight of a detonation. Reaper 6. The security guard, the Navy veteran who'd nodded at her during the first shift, went rigid. His face drained. His hand moved involuntarily to his own chest, the salute forming without permission. Master Chief. His voice cracked on the syllables. The lobby was soundless except for the ventilator's mechanical breath coming from an unconscious patient being wheeled past, a sound like distant machinery that belonged to another world entirely. The brass arrived like a storm front. A 2-star general in dress blue strode through the automatic doors, and behind him came 3 people with folder portfolios and the particular exhaustion of federal investigators who'd been working through the night. The general was reading from a tablet before he was fully inside the building. His voice carried the tone of a man delivering facts, not questions. Bronze Star for leadership under fire during Operation Enduring Freedom, Kandahar Province, 2012. He glanced up at Brooke for the first time. Silver Star for coordination of cross-branch extraction mission. His eyes moved to Whitfield, taking in the polo shirt, the cheap shoes, the absolute panic radiating from the surgeon like heat off asphalt. 2 Purple Hearts. Combat injuries, sustained in theater. The general paused. The room held its breath. It was the kind of silence that happens before lightning strikes. And the Navy Cross for extracting 12 wounded soldiers under fire in Bagram, 2013. All 12 soldiers survived. 12. He lowered the tablet. You've been looking for one of our best, Dr. Whitfield. And she's been standing 3 feet from your vending machine. The ranger in the wheelchair moved with the same precision Brooke had felt in her own bones for 20 years, the economy of motion that came from knowing exactly how far bullets could travel. His voice was quiet. It didn't need to be loud. Reaper 6 saved my life twice, he said. Once when I was bleeding out in a supply truck in Kandahar with shrapnel in my left lung, and last night when this man was too busy protecting his kickback scheme to answer his phone. He gestured toward Whitfield with the same level of regard one shows a piece of litter. She cracked my sternum open. Direct cardiac massage. Hand steady as a surgical laser. While he was somewhere making phone calls about terminating her. The words hung in the air like a surgical blade suspended between 2 moments. Whitfield's mouth opened. Nothing emerged. His career, his reputation, his entire architecture of leverage and favors and whispered conversations with board members, all of it had been built on the assumption that this woman was exactly what she appeared to be. Just a nurse. Just a probationary hire with excellent documentation who asked too many questions about phantom procedures. He'd never considered the possibility that she was something else entirely. A resident near the back of the lobby, the same one who'd been standing next to Whitfield during grand rounds 3 weeks earlier, had his phone out. His hands were shaking slightly as he aimed it at Whitfield's face, capturing the exact moment when the surgeon's expression shifted from triumph to the realization that he'd been standing next to a decorated military intelligence asset the entire time. The recording lasted 43 seconds. It took 11 minutes for the first share. 30 minutes for it to reach the news networks. 45 minutes for it to reach Dr. Caroline Mercer, Whitfield's medical school mentor, at Johns Hopkins in Baltimore. By the time Brooke was being escorted out of the hospital, not by security to be fired, but by the general to a waiting motorcade, the video had 300,000 views. By that evening, it had 4 million. The audio was grainy, the resolution poor, but the message was crystalline. A surgeon in a Hugo Boss suit, voice dripping with condescension, calling a woman a nightingale like it was a punchline. Nightingale, did you actually finish nursing school? The laugh. His laugh. The exact moment of his destruction, captured at 1080p. Dr. Caroline Mercer watched it twice in her office, her jaw locked so tightly her temples ached. She'd trained Whitfield. She'd written his letters of recommendation. She'd watched him build a career on precision and intellect, then watched him throw it away on the casual cruelty of a woman he'd fundamentally misunderstood. She was a decorated army surgeon herself, 3 tours, 2 combat deployments, a shoulder that ached in the rain from an IED blast in Fallujah. She typed her editorial response in 17 minutes, each sentence like a surgeon's incision, precise and purposeful. The title was simple, The Moral Bankruptcy of Modern Medicine, What We Owe to Those Who Served. She submitted it to the New England Journal of Medicine at 2:23 a.m. By 7 that morning, it was published online. By 9, it had triggered calls from the hospital board's chairman, 3 federal investigators, and the director of the Joint Commission for Hospital Accreditation. Whitfield's power source, every bit of institutional leverage he'd accumulated, had been built on the assumption that his victims were powerless. The moment that assumption shattered, so did everything else. The board meeting convened that evening. Emergency session. Whitfield wasn't present, his attorney had advised him to remain silent and distant. That advice was exactly 14 hours too late. The investigators had already accessed 7 years of billing records. They'd already found the phantom procedures. The inflated charges for procedures never performed. The kickbacks from medical supply companies that materialized as cash deposits into a personal account registered in his wife's maiden name. 18 months of systematic fraud totaling $2.3 million, all of it billed to veteran patients, all of it signed off by a man who'd spent the last 3 weeks trying to fire the one person in the hospital actually documenting the theft. The nursing director who'd supported Whitfield's termination campaign quietly submitted her resignation before lunch. The board members who'd owed him favors suddenly discovered urgent reasons to recuse themselves. His suspension was unanimous and immediate. His medical license went under review. Federal prosecutors opened a formal investigation. The country club called him personally to inform him that membership privileges had been revoked, effective immediately. By Friday, his wife had filed for separation and retained a divorce attorney who specialized in asset seizure. 6 months later, in a strip mall on the outskirts of San Diego, between a tax preparation service and a vape shop, a man in a cheap polo shirt with an insurance company logo sat at a folding table, handing out flyers for supplemental health policies to people who averted their eyes as they walked past. Marcus Whitfield didn't look up. He didn't see the woman in the navy dress whites who slowed her car at the traffic light, who took in the folding table and the man behind it for exactly 4 seconds before the light changed and she moved forward again. She didn't stop. She didn't need to. Brooke Sullivan stood in the Cedar Creek Medical lobby in her dress whites, the morning light cutting through the windows like a surgical laser, and the full rack of medals on her chest caught the light and held it. 3 bronze stars. A silver star. 2 purple hearts. And the Navy Cross, the highest honor, positioned where everyone could see it clearly. The Army Ranger stood beside her in his own dress uniform, his left arm still slightly stiff from the wound that would have been fatal without her hands inside his chest cavity at 2:34 a.m. on a night that had changed everything. He held something small in his palm. A challenge coin. The weight of unit history pressed into a piece of metal no larger than a thumbprint. "You carried yours," he said, nodding toward the tarnished coin now visible on her uniform. The same coin she'd held through Kandahar and Bagram and Edina at 3 in the morning when everything had still hung in balance. "Now carry mine." She accepted it. The weight was familiar, every soldier who'd ever served understood that weight, the physical manifestation of belonging to something larger than herself, something that would never let her fall completely. The security guard approached and stood at attention. His hand came up in a salute so sharp it sounded like fabric snapping. She returned it, the motion automatic, perfect, the gesture of one warrior recognizing another. The nursing staff who'd avoided her eyes during the firing, who'd looked away when Whitfield had publicly humiliated her at the vending machine, now lined both sides of the lobby entrance in a gesture that wasn't mandatory and wasn't coordinated and meant everything. They applauded without speaking. The high-value patient from the secure wing, the naval intelligence officer whose treatment she'd been monitoring the entire time, had made full recovery and provided testimony that shut down Whitfield's entire fraud network. 17 other veterans had come forward with documentation of false billing. The trail led back to supply companies, back to insurance executives, back to a network that had been quietly stealing from the people who'd given everything. The general approached with new papers in a manila folder. Another hospital, another city, another cover identity, another embedded mission protecting those who served. This was what came after the revelation, the return to the work that mattered, the missions that didn't make the news, the quiet guardianship that happened in the spaces between moments. Brooke touched both challenge coins, the old and the new, two pieces of metal that represented everything sacrifice meant. The ranger met her eyes for the final time. "Why do you keep doing this? After everything you've seen," he asked. His voice carried the exhaustion of someone who'd bled in a supply truck, who'd opened his eyes to find hands keeping him alive, who understood that some people didn't choose comfort when they could choose service. Brooke looked around the lobby one final time. At the nurses. At the patients being wheeled past. At the security guard still standing at attention. At the screens now broadcasting normal programming, the breaking news cycle already moving on to other stories, other crises, other worlds that didn't know what had happened in this hospital 3 weeks ago. "The ones who have seen the worst often give the most," she said quietly. She picked up her bag. The automatic doors opened toward a hallway and beyond that the parking lot and beyond that the next mission, already waiting, already becoming solid in her mind. She didn't look back. The doors closed behind her. The lobby returned to normal. But in the ER, in a shadow box mounted on the wall near the trauma bay, the dog tags that had started everything now hung beneath a placard, "In service to those who serve." Nobody needed to know which ward the Medal of Honor winner worked in. Nobody needed to know where she went next. And that, exactly, was the point. Hit like if this story got you. And tell me, have you ever been underestimated at work, only to prove them all wrong? I read every comment. Subscribe if you haven't already.